Right guys, so we're going to work through a couple of different tricep push down or rope push down variations here, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what different tools are at your disposal, and also different programming strategies that you can kind of use here to change the exercise experience for individuals, and also maybe create some sort of drop sets or mechanical drop sets within your programming. So the first thing I want you to make note of is the fact that when you use these types of implements, you're not just dealing with the line of force that comes from the cable itself. So generally when we talk about cable variations, like if we were to use a single cable like this, the handle that I'm using is the same as the line of force. The line of force is basically the direction that goes straight into my hand. So it's the line from the cable going straight down through the handle, basically acting at the center of the handle. That's a little bit different here on a rope like this, because it's basically getting split. So if you're holding the rope in such a way that it's just still straight, then the line of force is also still straight. But what begins to happen as you pull that rope apart, you're now pulling at an angle to the line of force, so that actually changes the resistance that you're dealing with. So if I was to totally exaggerate this and I was pulling that rope to the side, you know, if you pull it totally apart there, you've got this additional challenge here now that's coming in the form of Paddy having to push his arms out away from each other. And the further that's exaggerated, the less vertical force is actually being produced. So he's not actually applying much force to move this cable, because all the force is being dissipated outwards. So the resistance is going basically from one arm to the other. So the resistance or the force produced from one arm, from elbow extension, is basically creating the challenge on the other. So as a result, if you go through a couple of reps there, Paddy, you have a standard kind of rope push down and you spread it at the end, the resistance is actually increasing a lot as you get to the bottom on this standard variation. So as a result, what some people will find is that they'll have a weight that they've chosen for the rope push down, but it's really, really easy at the top for them, but really, really hard at the bottom. So as a result, we end up in a position where our limiting factor is actually our strength in that shortened position. And as you fatigue there, you might be fatigued in the fully shortened position, but you haven't actually trained the rest of the range of motion very effectively. So the point at which you reach failure or concentric failure is going to be different than what it might be on an exercise where the resistance was more consistent throughout the range, or better fit your capacity to produce force. So one way that we can actually start to overcome this is by adding a second rope. So if I add a second rope to this, this actually overcomes the problem that we're dealing with initially. Because when you have that rope initially, you get a large angle at the bottom. And essentially, the greater the angle between the two implements that you're pulling, the greater the challenge is going to be in that bottom position. So when you begin to use two ropes, now what you'll see is that it remains more vertical throughout for Paddy. Okay, so he's quite tall, so he's going to have to kneel down here, but there's not as much of a change here. So we're basically seeing that that angle doesn't change quite as much, and as a result we don't get that massive change in the resistance throughout the range. So initially what we saw with the single rope was that we were starting with two straight lines and finishing with two lines at 45 to 60 degrees. Whereas here we've got this maybe, you know, somewhere between 15 to 30 degree angle at the top, and maybe we're talking like 25 to 40 degree angle at the bottom. So we're not seeing a massive change in terms of the resistance that's coming from the rope or the implement that we're pulling itself. So that's something to keep in mind. And in general, if you have a client who's saying, you know, I just find it real difficult to get to the bottom position, or what you might see is that when they get to the bottom, they kind of use a bit of momentum, or they'll roll their shoulders inward to finish the rep. If you're seeing that happening, then using something like this can be really helpful. If you don't have access to a second rope, what you can also do is just provide a bit of a spot to your client, you know. So if Paddy's doing the rep and he's struggling towards the bottom, and I see that that's where he's failing, if you go quite slowly here, what I can start to do is just assist him into that bottom part of the range. And then he can do the eccentric himself, he can do most of the range of motion himself, and I just apply a little bit of support to get into the end of that range. And that now allows him to get a nice challenge throughout the range of motion without being limited by just that one part. In addition to that, what you have to realize is that this also changes the direction of the forces that you're dealing with. So if you've got your hands out in front here, we ideally want the forces to be challenging elbow extension in and of itself, okay? However, when you're dealing with an implement that you're actually pulling outwards, you're now dealing with this outward force on the elbow as well, apart from just elbow extension. So what some people might actually find is that, you know, it's a little bit uncomfortable on the elbows when they use the rope. What you also find at the bottom of the rope is that, if you go to the bottom again, Paddy, sometimes you can find that because you're having to like really twist it, that can be uncomfortable for someone who has a history of elbow pain, okay? So in some cases, you might want to, again, play around with that resistance or just add the second rope. Now, what you do have to think about too is that it's not always a case of trying to create perfection from the beginning. Because if I have a client and they're using an implement like this and it's easily accessible for them and they're having no issues and their triceps are blowing up and their elbows are fine, I'm not going to be jumping in with 20 suggestions about how we can improve it, because we want to keep things simple and we want to keep things practical so that when our clients do visit the gym themselves, they don't have to go setting up things, you know. But these types of implements and these types of adjustments become really useful when we're trying to troubleshoot. When we have that client with elbow pain, when we have that client that's struggling to train their triceps, you know, or we have that client who just hates this exercise because of how difficult it is at the bottom. So that's where you start to bring in these changes. Now, with all that said, there are additional adjustments you can make to this exercise in its purest form. So, you know, Paddy's just standing up in a basic variation here, and he's just performing his triceps extension as he is, just standing. So elbows are by the sides of the body. And what you'll see is if you pause at about 90 degrees for me, so come up to here, you'll see here that that's the point at which the actual resistance from the cable itself is going to be greatest, because the line of force has the greatest distance there from the elbow joint. So that means there's a larger moment arm. As he comes down to the bottom then, the cable is really close. If we look at that distance for the moment arm, the cable is really close to the elbow joint, and hence the resistance from purely the cable is going to be much lighter here on the elbow if we don't consider the actual rope. So with the rope, that's going to increase it a bit. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of here. As you begin to do some of the other variations, that does change. So if you do the leaned over variation for me, Paddy. So as he leans over here, there's a little bit of a difference. So what we've got here is that the triceps, or the long head of the triceps at least, because they're also elbow extensors, they're not going to be in their fully shortened position here, so they won't kind of have that cramping sensation. But what's also happening is that as he comes up to the top, he's getting into a little bit more elbow flexion as he is here. And as he comes to the bottom, there's a little bit less of a reduction in terms of that moment arm to the elbow, and that all depends on how much you're leaned over. So some people will lean over even more than Paddy is and have the hands out in front. So when you start to play around with that, we start to see that there's a greater distance there between the cable and the elbow at the bottom. And obviously if you're standing up totally tall and you're really close, if you come in really close and then perform the elbow extension, as you get to the bottom there, that cable's as close as it can be to the elbow joint, and that's going to be reducing the resistance that you're dealing with. But remember, we are dealing with that rope as well, so you have to think about how that factors in, okay? So then another variation that you can do here is if you step back from me, Paddy, what I want you to do is just bend over, perform a tricep extension as you are, and then bring the arms back actively. So this is another way that you can start to adjust this exercise by actually extending the elbow and then also extending the shoulder, because that long head of the tricep there on the inside high up, that also extends the shoulder. It's a biarticular muscle, and hence it has two functions. So if you bring those two things together, that can really start to light up that part of the tricep. So that's a nice variation to consider. Now what you could do is that you could just use this in a kind of a mechanical drop set type fashion, or mechanical superset, where you initially start with the variation where you're just doing your pure tricep extension. And then let's say he's getting fatigued, keep the arms straight at the bottom now, and now all he's going to do is that kind of movement of just the arms forward and back. So we're done with the elbow extension function, and now we're using the shoulder extension function, as if he's doing a little bit of a pullover. So if you're someone that really wants to, you know, bring up that long head of the triceps and you're trying to light up the triceps, that's a really nice way of kind of bringing in some novelty into your training. Another thing to keep in mind there, guys, is that, you know, with a lot of our clients, they do want to enjoy their training, and sometimes that sensation of, you know, having a bit of an extra burn in a particular area of a muscle, especially as you explain the rationale, that can be great positive reinforcement for them understanding what they're doing and actually enjoying the process. So we do have to remember that enjoyment and adherence really does come into these discussions as well. So as you can see, guys, when we're talking about a push down, there's many different ways that you can perform it. There are subtle differences between variations, and we can use different handles to change the way that the resistance changes, and hence work with more clients. So if clients are coming into you, they have elbow pain and that one stubborn exercise, you now have the tools to begin to play around with some of these things. And always remember that you always have that tool of spotting, you know, or of applying manual resistance. So do spot your clients. You know, if you find that if there's points in any range of motion, whether it be this exercise or others, where they're really just struggling to finish the rep and they're finding that, oh, you know, I can just never do that part of the range, adjust that exercise for them. You know, that's what we're there for as personal trainers, and hopefully that gives you some stuff that you can apply here and in many other exercises in the gym.